I think first and foremost, the thing that people don't really think about at all is like, what is your genuine purpose or motivation for it? Your core purpose for doing a thing is basically the reason that is going to drive you to continue doing it. Everyone gets cancelled for saying anything because everything offends everyone. And at the point of such protective attitude, no one builds up any resilience. No one takes any personal responsibility for their own feelings and stuff. And actually the downstream of that can totally lead to mental health collapse.
On the show today, we have Dan Murray-Serter, the host of the UK's #1 careers podcast, Secret Leaders, and he's the co-founder of the company Heights, which is leading the way in BrainCare. We deep dive into topics such as mental health, cancel culture, mindset, success, and we examine these things through the lens of podcasting. Dan has learned a lot about how to approach a podcast, and I feel that his lessons really apply to many things through life, which make this a really great discussion for a mindset show, which is what this is. A quick disclosure is that I am an investor in Dan's company's Heights. I just believe in what they're doing and think it's awesome. But this is not a sales pitch, and this is just a mindset podcast episode. With that, welcome to the Growth Mindset Podcast. Absolute pleasure to have you here. We're going to launch the episode with a bang and go straight into Dan's biggest interviewing lessons from 6 years of running one of the UK's most successful podcasts.
I've kind of learned two major things in podcasting in terms of interviewing people. One is that you can go broad or you can go deep, but you can't really do both. So do you want your audience to hear a bunch of interesting stuff at quite surface level over the period of time? Or do you want to hear one specific topic and go like nice and deep on that? But where podcast interviews tend to fall down, I think, is trying to achieve both, because you tend to achieve neither. And also just, the data that I see from my podcasting, basically anything over 30 minutes, the content needs to be really good to keep people. So 30 minutes is fine. 45 minutes is like, okay. An hour, it's like, you really need it to be just really, really great for people to pay attention. So then it's down to the art of editing. But, at some point the question comes up from a listener, and I do it as well. Am I learning enough, or is this interesting enough? So typically, learning enough for me is usually where you go deep enough. And is this interesting is when you go broad enough. That's sort of one thing that I guess I've learned in reflection. And then the other thing that I've learned is, typically speaking, the more prep, I like to do some prep for guests, but the more prep I do, the worse the interview.
Yeah. So
you found the same?
Literally was going to ask on that question being how do you prepare to shape an interview to go broad or deep and plan to make that happen?
So I used to be very rigid on what I want to do. So these are questions I want to ask. This is the focus. Secret Leaders is a business show. So I also very want to get into the nuts and bolts of the business, the failures, if there were any, what they learned, etc., etc., etc. And then I had quite a few guests where that just wasn't good. And I carried on anyway. And then I listened to them all back and I was like, this interview's kind of shit. And it's kind of shit because the guest didn't really want to talk about that stuff. But I was adamant that I wanted to talk about that stuff. And so I kind of carried on because I'm I know what my listeners like. I know what my audience likes. And therefore I know what value they get. And therefore I have to follow this format because it's why they come back every week. But then I heard, or I read maybe a snippet from Tim Ferriss, who obviously is a very different type of podcaster. But in general, he's actually your audience tend to be there for you. Less so your guests. So they build up a rapport with the host. I mean, obviously if you're Tim Ferriss, it's kind of a different level, but your audience will build up a relationship with you. The interviews that they will enjoy the most are the ones where you're really interested and you're having a really good time. Because then the conversations tend to flow really naturally for the guest as well. And so he said, whenever I'm having an interview and I can tell it's really going off course, it's not really going the way that I want or whatever, I've got two tactics. One is I will change course. So I'll figure out what they want to talk about, and then I will just go and talk about whatever they want and make sure that, that kind of works. Or two, if it's a really shit guest and it's really time consuming and they're not really playing ball, then I will just do loads more talking. And I will basically become the star of the episode and we'll just cut it down a lot more, but I can't really force them to, and so I'll just do more. So I've been trying to lean into really more the first approach, to be honest. I still haven't really done a lot of that yet, the second approach. But I've done a lot of the first approach. And literally the last interview I did, interestingly, went exactly like this. I was speaking to a guy called Vikas Shah, who has an MBE, has a really interesting company, like all of this kind of stuff. Is a really interesting guy. But actually, like, I picked up on the fact that he'd had 4 suicide attempts. So we end up, like, obviously, like, talking about, you know, mental health and suicide and wokeness and, you know, people's resilience and how defensive and soft society is becoming, and actually, like, the classic problem. And I say this and he is as well. This is why it was interesting. We're both liberals on the left. And yet we were both saying, like, you know, we're recognizing the fact that actually a lot of this stuff leads to a mental health crisis because everyone gets cancelled for saying anything because everything offends everyone. And at the point of such protective attitude, no one builds up any resilience. No one takes any personal responsibility for their own feelings and stuff. And actually the downstream of that is massive victimhood and really just like can totally lead to mental health collapse. And, you know, he was reflecting on his own experience sort of like behaving this way when he was younger and how it led to suicide attempts. And now he's much more resilient and all of this stuff. So end up having a really interesting conversation around resilience, liberalism, wokeness, you know, not things that I was anticipating talking to him about. I was only really planning to talk to him about business, and old me would have carried on just talking about business. New me was like, this is where the conversation's going. I'm going to lean into it. And it was a really, really good conversation that most importantly, we both really enjoyed. And when you both really enjoy something, you can almost be guaranteed that your listeners will as well.
Definitely. It can be a hard one sometimes when you don't know someone that well to know what you can go into in those areas. But it's just like picking up on like stuff that they feel like they have something they have more to say on, I guess.
Well, I guess the other side to this is like, is having a perspective, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the things is like, I'm comfortable owning my perspective. Doesn't mean my perspective is right, but I'm happy to have a perspective. And it might not be the same as his, but then at least we have a good debate. In this case, turns out we actually had a very similar perspective. So that created a good debate. But, you know, I understand, like a lot of people are very scared, just kind of the ridiculousness of it. A lot of people are very scared to just go on record and have any point of view. Because, frankly, there's just people out there cancelling everyone for anything, no matter when you said it. Yeah. So obviously it does make sense to just, like, be careful. But it is what it is. If you're willing to have an opinion, that's great.
Yeah. Do you think that as a podcaster, that's something you found's become harder in terms of just interviewing people over the past 5 years, that like people are a bit more worried about being cancelled?
It's a good question. I think people are getting terrified about stuff. Yeah, for sure. And they should. As in, like, they definitely should. Because fundamentally, I mean, it's happening, right? It's happening all over. People are getting, you know, comedians get cancelled for making jokes that are, like, outdated. And if that can happen to really famous people, why wouldn't it happen to, like, some absolute nobodies? So in the end, everyone just, like, ends up being, like, afraid to actually have an opinion in public. And yeah, it's really interesting because I was having this conversation with someone the other day. You know, this whole thing on free speech, which is, like, the topic du jour pretty much everywhere at the moment. I'm certainly not an expert or intellectual when it comes to free speech. Like, kind of broadly don't care too much about the topic. Like, never really have. But maybe that's like a point of privilege as well, where I like anticipated and expected before that people can have free speech. I feel a little bit like at the moment, it's been a really interesting conversation, a really interesting debate to kind of come from a point of view of awareness of like, I don't really have opinions here, and then trying to form them on the fly. In the wake of basically, you know, it's one of those things where you suddenly, you look around and it seems like people have unbelievably strong opinions on either side, and you realize that you never really had an opinion either way. And then you're like, wait, should I have had a very strong opinion either way? I think that's kind of how I would relate my perspective on this, which is maybe that is white privilege. I don't actually know, and how could I possibly know, because I wouldn't have the self-awareness of being outside my own white privileged body to have it. But like, I look at this debate and just think, I mean, there's a lot to learn on both sides.
Yeah.
What's your point of view? Do you have one? Or are you in a similar camp to me?
I think I am. The way you've described it, I really resonate with what you just said. I'm not sure it's just because you described it well, or if it's actually my opinion. I'm now trying to work out with my own perspective, but I feel like it's something I just took very for granted, and have now felt like I feel like I'm in the middle, and there's suddenly these people where you have to choose either side, and it's all pretty strong. And if you haven't chosen the side, you're like, that's already choosing, and it's a bad thing as well. And you're like, oh god, panic. We should have mostly free speech, but like not complete free speech because that can be bad. And then you sort of look silly and feel like you should have worked out a better way to have more conviction on the whole topic, which I think was what you said in a better way, basically.
I mean, I feel like there's a lot with a lot of topics, right? Like, suddenly realize that I seem to exist in a world where people have like unreal strong feelings, millions of people about these things that I've never really given much thought to, and feel a bit like left out, like I'm uneducated on seemingly very important things. But I'm okay with that. Sometimes I'm totally comfortable with the ignorance is bliss aspect of life, right? You can't know everything about everything. And I suppose as well, the other side to this being that life is a journey, and where you are on that journey, like actually, like where you are on that journey, where you live and who you are, and all of these things make up like whether or not you've had to actually confront this particular issue in society that is now the topic du jour. And I feel like that's kind of where I am at the moment, which is like, I guess I never really had to worry too much about how important free speech was to me. And when everyone asks like my opinion, I'm just kind of like, I don't know. Don't feel overly educated by it, but can see that everyone is getting unbelievably angry by it, is generally my opinion. And I probably feel that way about a lot of things.
Yeah, definitely, which is a point of privilege, especially when you look at the news of
definitely
Taliban still banning like education of girls and things, and you're like, what the hell? How can that be a thing? Like, it's nuts. So I'm now intrigued on various things and a bit confused with myself. So I guess I will go for a hard topic change back into podcasting.
Go for it.
So your first podcast, very successful, really interesting people that you have on. You've learned lots from doing it. And then you then start, well, this is Secret Leaders. You then started BrainCare. I think it had a different podcast title when you started.
Yeah, it was called Working In, which was a terrible name, it turns out. But I thought it was genius because working out is what you do for your body, so working in is what you do for your mind. But obviously everyone just thought it was a business podcast again, where I was just supporting people working.
Yeah, I thought it was like working indoors or something.
Yeah, no one got it. So we had a cheeky rebrand very quickly.
Okay, so the question I was going for was, what did you enjoy and learn from the first podcast, and how did that shape your decisions on starting the second podcast that had more of a purpose around actually building a business and growing it? And why did you make the differences in the second one?
What are the differences and why did we decide them? Well, it was actually experimental. I think first and foremost, the thing that people don't really think about with podcasts at all is like, what is your genuine purpose or motivation for it? Because it might get out of control one way or another, which is always like a nice problem to have. And that's what happened with Secret Leaders. What is your core purpose for doing the thing is basically the reason that is going to drive you to continue doing it. With Secret Leaders, the core purpose was I get to meet interesting leaders that I want to learn from, and I get to have a chat with them, and no one wants to fucking sit there and have their brains picked for a quick coffee. But, a lot of people are open to like talking about these things in a podcast, and if they feel like their insight is valuable and it's going to get heard by thousands of people, then why not? So on that basis, I'm very happy with how Secret Leaders went, because it's now become its own company. We just launched another podcast actually at that company around failure. We're launching 2 or 3 more this year, including like one bigger bet, with investigative journalism and like all sorts. So, and we're employing more people now. And so that's become like its own bootstrapped company, which when I say you start with an intention and it might go a certain way, that has become its own beast where at the end of the day, like what I wanted to do was interview interesting people, not run another company. So I've seriously hustled that business to a point where I've been able to employ people, hire a team, and get back to real clarity in that team, which is, hey guys, I don't run this business, I'm the host. You guys run this business, and I'm on the board, and I contribute all the time, and all this kind of stuff, obviously, but like, I'm the host. I'm not going to do any of the other stuff. So that's great, because I've kind of gotten myself back to specifically and only that one thing. sponsorships and revenue and business model and what equipment and should we hire this person? Obviously, I do the interviews to hire people, but like other than that, I'm like, you guys work it out. It's totally fine. I'm just a host. I think that's really important. With BrainCare, it's totally different.
Sam here, just diving in to provide some context on the next part of the episode. As I've mentioned, Dan runs the UK's #1 careers podcast, Secret Leaders, and he runs a second podcast for his company Heights. This second podcast is called BrainCare. Now, Heights is really innovating in the category of brain care and caring for your brain, etc. But for the rest of this episode, when Dan says the words brain care, what he means is the specific podcast that he is running and not talking about the general concept of caring for your brain, just so you don't get confused. Enjoy the show.
With BrainCare, it's totally different. One insight was like, I know how to do podcasting, firstly. And secondly, like the value that we get as a company is the opportunity to talk to really smart people in the space. We're just starting out. No one knows Heights. No one knows what BrainCare is or what we're trying to do. There's a pandemic. There are lots of different really good reasons why doing this made sense. For us, it was two sides to it. One was, what is our purpose? So, for us, we're never going to sell ads on BrainCare. It's not the point. So like the audience size, again, like it's very different doing a B2B podcast, right? At Secret Leaders, what matters is the audience size because we only survive through advertising. So without a committed audience, we don't get advertising revenue, which means we can't employ anyone because it's bootstrapped. Whereas at BrainCare, for Heights, the business is funding the podcast. It doesn't matter the size in that sense, other than obviously we want there to be listeners because we want there to be impact. But what we wanted was like a way to continue our customers' like education journey, basically, by hearing from all these brilliant people in snappy formats and just constantly get them sort of reinforcing the idea of what BrainCare is. Because the theory is like if our customers are listening to this podcast and they're reinforcing the idea of what BrainCare is, then by like common sense, like so is the supplement that we sell that they already take is part of the BrainCare journey. And so instead of us constantly being like, hey, take a supplement, hey, take a supplement, we're like, hey, here's some interesting content about BrainCare. The logic is we're trying to keep them interested and engaged in how to take care of their brain, which will help them feel better. And our product is one of the things that's helping them feel better. So it was kind of a like what you'd call in marketing spiel. It's a middle of the funnel podcast. It's not really for acquisition of new customers. Like it does happen, but it's not really for acquisition of customers. It's also not for converting customers. It's actually just generally for people who are already customers often, right? And want to continue like their learning journey. And because we're a subscription business, retention is actually like our biggest lever. Like our success is completely based on customer retention. The fact that we're able to pick up new customers and the fact that I'm able to speak to amazing people that I want to speak to about like some of the actually important and interesting things I want to talk about in the world, those are nice side effects. And they are obviously like by design more than by accident, but like they're not the primary purpose. So why this matters is because you also have to figure out energy versus time equation, as you do with anything in life. And actually, we got to, with BrainCare, because of the time that we launched it and how we did it, we were doing 15-minute episodes because we want them to be short and snappy and pack a lot of knowledge and insight into just 15 minutes. Made the consumption really, really high, which made the podcast very, very, very sticky, which is awesome. But we ended up getting to, I think, maybe 130 episodes or something inside a year. Like a huge volume of podcast episodes. And then it got to January and I was like, on a personal level right now, the business needs something else from me. We're hiring, we're scaling in America, we're doing all of these different things. And like, I think we need to do a bit of an analysis on, if we continue doing the podcast, what should the format be? Do we need to do more video? Because we weren't really focusing on video. And if we do need to do that, do we need to think about, do we need a studio? Do we need this? Anyway, the point was new questions were coming up. And my opinion on this stuff is like, if there's questions, we don't know how to answer them because we don't have time, then it would probably be crazy just to carry on for the sake of it for the moment. Let's stop. We have like an enormous bank of content now, which is amazing. Let's see how we can systematically and logically use that content at other aspects of the business in terms of brand building or whatever. And unless we can figure those things out as a team, maybe it isn't the best investment of our time right now. So for the time being, actually, we've stopped BrainCare, and for no reason other than, lots of podcasts take a season and then a break and then another season. So that's kind of what we're doing here, is like, let's regroup and think about it. But also just because, like, on my time personally, but it was like increasingly becoming a difficult hassle to fit that into, like, now to fit 2 podcasts a week into what is already like quite a busy working schedule. I'd just become a dad. This was like, 3 months after becoming a dad, like, when you want to have a nap, you can't have a nap because you're knackered, but you've got an interview, stuff like that, right? So,
and you're CEO of a seed level company.
Exactly. So I think it's really important to make sure, I think people don't do enough, but I think it's really important to make sure that you are questioning whether you are doing something because it's the right thing to do, or you're doing it because you can't stop.
Which is a very hard one, and can lead to burnout and general problems in a massive way. Do you think this is a question that you ask yourself regularly?
No, I think it's a question that most people don't ask themselves regularly, if I'm honest. But I think that they should. Definitely not. There's loads of things that I carry on doing. But it's a very hard equation because, there's really 2 facts. And it could be very hard. One is that 99% of all success is just not giving up. So, and in fairness, you see that, right? You see that in people's careers, you see that in popular podcast shows, etc., which is like, it took me 500 episodes before I got to XYZ, and you're like, fuck me, I'm only on 150. I'm not sure I can be bothered to do another 350 before I achieve success, or whatever. So you see that. But, like, of course, there's also the other side, which is, Einstein's definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. It's like, if it's not really growing, it's not really working. You do sadly also see people with 1,000 episodes of something and only 100 listeners, or 1,000 episodes of something and only 100 viewers. And it's like, mad respect to those people, but also, like, got to be conscious and aware if you're not actually looking at your data and actually questioning whether you should carry on. Yeah,
it's definitely sort of actually learning as you're going along and improving what you're doing, rather than just doing the same things. Right. That is the interview. Thank you so much for Dan coming on the show and just transparently ruminating on all these things that actually really affect us and are very important. I have thought a lot about the general concept of polarization and just the increased feeling that you have to choose sides, and actually perhaps most of us are somewhere in the middle, not so much on our side, thinking that we're the weird ones when actually it's just the odd people who have the loudest voices that are on these extreme sides. But that is a concept and topic for another day. For now, I'll just finish. If you enjoyed listening to Dan, he will be back on the show in a few weeks' time to discuss entrepreneurship and mindsets and mental health there, because he's learned so much about building companies and life. He's just a really cool person. He was also on the show a few years back if you want to dig into the archives, or he runs the Secret Leaders podcast and the BrainCare podcast. If you want to follow those, they are really good listens. On that, enjoy the week. And remember, if you want to enjoy your life, that does start with enjoying today. So be nice to yourself and be nice to someone else. Ciao.